And you see this increasing emphasis on saying, oh, well, can't trust parents to do the right thing. The state had better take over the instilling of values in our children. That's a disastrous idea. Absolutely disastrous. I think the cruelest thing of all is to think we're just a collection of atoms floating around and there's no rhyme or reason to anything.
By way of quick introduction, you are a farmer. You were former Deputy Prime Minister to Australia in the Howard government up until 2005. But now you're probably much more widely known, at least internationally, because of your platform, Conversations with John Anderson, which I think you're up to 52 million YouTube views, something like that. And you've spoken to the likes of Matthew McConaughey, Douglas Murray, Steven Pinker, the list goes on. Oh, and of course Jordan Peterson, who I understand you've become good friends with now. So it's such a privilege to have you on this platform. But can we go back to the start and talk about how you grew up?
Well, it's lovely to be with you, and I think it's terrific that you're seeking to build a platform to communicate in this way, because I've become convinced that you don't influence the public debate now through the mainstream media. It's all online. So good on you. Look, I'm a sixth-generation farmer and grazier from northwest New South Wales. My family went out there in the 1820s from Scotland. Great-great-grandfather was a Glasgow-educated doctor who served with the British Army, and then thought with his young bride that he should try Australia. So he did, and they moved to the northwest of New South Wales, not far from where I now live, in around 1840. And actually they prospered. They did very well over time. I was a mid-baby boomer. My mother and father delayed marriage. Their lives were badly interrupted by the Second World War. My father was in the famous 9th Division, which fought in the North African desert, ultimately successful in the first major turnaround for the German army and the Allies were led by the famous General Montgomery from Britain. But my father was horrendously wounded and not expected to live. So he sort of slowly clawed his way back to life, physically and mentally, I think, after the war. But I was not born until nearly 10 years after the war. I sometimes quip. I chose, might not be a brilliant person, but I did choose my parents brilliantly. They were Australian, and they were rural Australians. My timing wasn't bad either, because I missed the horrors of war, even though I, in some ways, lived it through my father's experiences. And I was actually too young for Vietnam, which was a trauma that affected a lot of men in Australia, families in Australia, who were a little bit older than me. So that's the shorthand. I'm married to the world's most wonderful woman, Julia, and we have 4 children, 1 son, 3 daughters, and 5 grandchildren. And I alternate between being a farm labourer, because my son now runs our business with his wife, and doing things like my own conversations, which are an attempt to really just provide a conduit for good thinking for people who want to hear what some of the best thinkers around the world are thinking without interruption. So I try to host them in a way that lets the listeners do the interpreting and not having it filtered through my prejudices, even though I don't try to hide my own basic philosophical positioning.
Mm-hmm. So going back to your childhood, I'm just trying to think about what values your parents instilled in you for you to then carve out the path that you've been on.
My mother died when I was only 3 of undiagnosed stomach cancer, leaving me and my sister, who had been born just 14 months after me. So my father, I guess, loomed larger because he was a constant. We had a lot of what were called governesses in those days. They're quite common in Australia today in rural areas. There are many European girls, many British girls. They go out to Australia and want to find, an opportunity to live in the bush for a while, and they go and look after children I had a succession of them, Australian and French, as I recall. They played a role. One in particular I was very fond of. One or two I recoiled from. But my father was... It's a good question. He was a very traditional sort of person. In many ways, he'd had that horrendous war experience. He'd lost his wife. So there was something of a pall over his life.
Did he talk about it?
No. When he was together with his mates, they would talk about the good times, but they'd never talk about the bad times. It was only after he died that I was able to piece together the horrors. It must have been horrendous. The dawn of the second day of El Alamein, the Germans found the range. A Panzer gun opened up on their anti-tank unit, which Dad was leading. A young man panicked, jumped up out of the trench. My father tried to pull him back down. He would still wake up late in his life, in fact, right at the end of his life from time to time, screaming, get down, you're going to get hit. Well, they were both hit, and the younger man died. Dad, who wouldn't have been 25, was so seriously wounded, as I say, that he nearly didn't survive. So there was that sort of, you were very conscious. People treated him differently. He was a war hero, and you knew that there was a respect for that. He wouldn't talk about it. He didn't like going to Anzac Day. Very interesting. It was a mystery to me. And so I've always found it, personally, a bit hard to go to Anzac Day myself, even when I was Deputy Prime Minister. Sometimes I would think my father didn't want to remember. So he didn't want to be involved in Anzac Day. It's the first time I've ever said that publicly. He was someone who loathed pride and front. He was a very gifted sportsman. And he took really seriously the Donald Bradman view that you should be modest in victory and gracious in defeat. If I wanted to get into trouble, I would put on a front, I'd be puffed up or say something that was proud, and bang, I'd cop it. That's the most distinct thing I remember about his standards. He had an incredible sense of humour, and sometimes that wasn't evident in day-to-day life on the farm. But you'd see him with some of his old mates. He had the quickest wit of any of them. I look back on it. I suspect this is true for an awful lot of children. In later years, you start to appreciate your parents more, and you wish you could have said more or had said more and not been as judgmental of the failings as you perceive them to be. We're not very good in some ways, we human beings, at relationships. We ought to be better because we're relational beings. So one of the things I do try and say to people is think clearly, but express also your feelings and affections and your regard for other people. Build relationships. We're nothing without them.
And that's exactly like what you're doing now, right? Which is so different from politics. Like having these long-form conversations and letting someone speak and then developing a relationship with them that way.
Yeah, thank you. I'll take that as a clear-sighted perspective on what we're trying to do. When I say we, the little team, and particularly a good friend who quietly stays in the background and offers a lot of comment and a lot of support. We've never monetarised them. In fact, I draw nothing out of them, and they run at a very slight loss. But our whole objective is to try and open up space for people to think, to respect one another, to recognise that you can legitimately hold a different set of views without being a terrible human being. And our culture is paying a terrible price for demonising others simply because they have a different perspective, rather than allowing themselves to be challenged. The old, I know it's trite, but the Voltaire, attributed to Voltaire, the line that I may disagree with you, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. It is really important, and funnily enough, it's most important for minorities, for people who are not being heard, to be able to say, look, free speech matters, and I need to be able to talk out about these things.
Mm-hmm. So, during your childhood, were you developing any of these thoughts, or how did you end up going into politics and becoming so passionate about some of these things?
I think after a terrible family accident when I was a schoolboy, in which I inadvertently became the instrument of an innocent accident where my sister was killed, I had to ask myself the very big questions in life. And I think when tragedy hits, you can fold into yourself, see yourself as a victim, and demand to be seen as a victim, and just become miserable. Or you break out the other way and say, well, this is a sadness that will stay with me forever, but I need to get on with life, and I need to learn the lessons. I need to be sympathetic to others who find themselves in situations that they could never have imagined. And that's a lot of people, by the way. So I've tried, probably inadequately, to be as human as I can in relationships. And it is I'm really impressed and thankful that I think you've seen something of what I'm trying to do. It's not about point scoring. It's about trying to build understanding, to build bridges, but also to break away from the way in which we tend to allow our feelings to dominate our thinking. It's a good thing for the head to be rooted through the heart. It's a bad thing if ideas stop at the heart and don't engage the brain. And there's too much emotive thinking in our culture now. Too much of it's based on raw emotion, not calm reason. You need both.
How old were you when that accident happened?
About 14. Excuse me. So quite a vulnerable age. And it took me to a place where I felt no one else understands because they've not been here, even though people were trying to understand and were very good to me at school, in the family, what have you. But I did need to find answers. Otherwise, I don't think I would have made it.
And how did you go about finding answers? I'm so sorry, by the way, to have.
That's all right. Well,
your mum.
You have known tragedy yourself. And as I say, there are two ways to respond. One is to fold in and let it shut you down. Another is to say, I can't let this shut me down. I have to find answers. I have to find some degree of peace and reconciliation and make sense out of this. And so I was at a boarding school in Sydney. And I came from a non-religious home, but personal faith for me provided at least the comfort of knowing that it wasn't meant to be like this. I think the cruelest thing of all is to think we're just a collection of atoms floating around and there's no rhyme or reason to anything. Some people say, how could you believe in a merciful God when bad things happen? My answer would be to believe that there's no explanation, there's no pain, and there's no ending to the pain. The wounds won't be bound up. That to me is infinitely harder and infinitely more soul-destroying than to think it'll never be fixed. It can never be made sense of. Woe is me. And I think in part it's made me, on the one hand, perhaps I don't often express this well, but you've asked me the question, more sympathetic to understanding people who have had a tough time and are victims. But it's made me less sympathetic of people who wallow in it, and particularly unsympathetic to those who try to weaponise victims and then want to keep them in their victim status rather than solve their problems. That is not a kind and compassionate human thing to do. And there are times, frankly, when some people need to hear the message, pull yourself together, get up off the floor and make the best of it. That's not meant to be unsympathetic at all to those who have had a tough experience. And I'm in England as you and I talk, and I was talking to Constantine Kisson from trigonometry yesterday, and we were talking about this very thing. You can't wallow in it forever. That's so destructive. That's so sad. Got to make the best of it.
Yeah.
Got to look for a way forward. And Rabbi Jonathan Sachs here in London in a conversation made the point, what if the Jews after the Holocaust had said, well, we're going to retreat into victimhood and the world owes us? They didn't do that. After that terrible, extraordinary example of man's capacity for utter depravity of the gas chambers and all that those Jewish people experienced, I think we overlook the fact that we need to give them great credit for not playing the victim card by and large. They rightly insist that we not forget what happened, and we shouldn't. But they say they themselves have gone on and built a nation, rebuilt their culture, and make an enormous contribution in so many ways. I must say, as a visitor to Britain, I'm sometimes staggered. This is just a sideways comment, but an important one, at the re-emergence of anti-Semitism on the left as much as the right, if not more on the left than the right.
How have you noticed that?
Well, it was rife under the previous leader of the Labor Party, and he was very reluctant to stamp it out. And it got a lot of coverage at the time. And I have Jewish friends in England who tell me how the situation's deteriorated and how they feel concerned about it.
Yeah, we've spoken about this on this podcast a lot for some reason. Like 40% of the guests on this podcast are Jewish.
Right.
So, but at Cambridge, I heard Jeremy Corbyn speak, and he was the president of the Cambridge Union, was Jewish at the time, and kind of confronted him with everything. So, but I mean, it just didn't really go anywhere. He couldn't even apologise to the guy for he was a member of the Labor Party and had experienced from within the Labor Party anti-Semitism. And all Corbyn needed to say was, I'm so sorry that you experienced that. But he couldn't.
Well, that was a point Jonathan Sachs made to me. It was a really valuable one. He said, one of the great problems in our culture is we don't do forgiveness anymore. So that's something that the Judeo-Christian stream gave our culture, a willingness to acknowledge that none of us are perfect, not even me, and that occasionally I will need to ask other people for forgiveness. And cancel culture doesn't do apologies. So I said to Lord Jonathan Sachs, who of course has passed on, an incredible thinker, what happens when you forget what it is to forgive? And he said, well, you can only hope then that people will forget your misdemeanours. But that doesn't happen in a social media age, because something you said 20 or 30 years ago can be dragged up against you. And, frankly, a family can't work if there's no forgiveness. A community can't work. A nation can't work if there's no forgiveness. And there's two aspects to forgiveness. There's a willingness to ask for forgiveness, and there's a willingness to grant it and accept it. And heal and move on.
And I think on that victim point or wallowing in it, it's when the individual has to realise that it's better for them, as you did, to move through it. Of course, grief, you have to grieve and you have to get help and support for whatever you're going through, but that you will feel a lot better if you take the individual responsibility for your own life and move forward. And that's most of the conversations on this podcast are people telling stories of, drug addiction or some kind of terrible thing has happened in their life, and wallowing in it has kept them stuck. And I've experienced as well with depression, being a victim doesn't help you feel better. And the day that you realise, actually, I'm going to take responsibility, your whole world becomes so much better, and then you're able to help other people as well. And just like that's the only path I see to moving towards a happier, more peaceful world.
Yeah, I don't think you can really make much sense of life without forgiveness, because it has to begin with a willingness to acknowledge that you're not perfect yourself. Now, the problem we've got now is that we really are raised on a diet of thinking that the world is, or life is a battle between good people and bad people. And we encourage young people to think, you're a good person, and if somebody's against you or disagrees with you, they're a bad person. Well, that's terribly limiting. That is a very reductionist view of humanity. It's a very dumb view. And most people intuitively see, the minute it's pointed out, how inappropriate it is. But then, in many ways, the whole thing's harder to break free of, because we live in this age when the greatest virtue is seen to be autonomy, self-autonomy. It's all about me. I will find myself from within. Whereas I think every great belief system and every great creed that's been of any value down through the ages has taught us that actually we need to look without. We need a bigger story. We're not up to the task of being God for ourselves. If I were God over my life, well, I'm a pretty inadequate and hopeless and limited and flawed God. Nothing terribly noble about me to look up to, if I can put it that way. We need a bigger story, in my view, than thinking it's about ourselves and I can do this. I have 3 daughters, and I was often surprised at their annual speech days. They'd have an old girl of the school back telling the girls, to be honest, haven't said this very often, sometimes I think they gave appalling advice about how you can have it all. You can do everything. You can have a career and a family just like I have. And I think it reeks of vanity and it reeks of bad advice.
So what was your process going through school about thinking what you would do? Was it just a given that you would work on the farm?
No. Funnily enough, my dad encouraged me to go and train for something else. And I had quite modest aspirations. I thought I'd like to be a country lawyer, and combine farming with a challenging job. I think I was pretty naive. And anyway, I went off to university after school. Didn't like law at all. The faculty didn't think much of me. So I just did an arts degree. And I was offered a couple of pretty good jobs, actually. And I went home to my father and said, well, I've had these offers. What do you think? And it hit me, his reaction. I suddenly realised that although he'd always said to me, don't come back to the land, the idea that it was all over. I'd been through school, university. I was now going to go and get a job. I wouldn't be back on the farm. Probably wouldn't get back there even to visit much. It was devastating to him. So I abruptly, on the spot, changed course, just like that. Said, all right, well, I'll wrap up at university and come back and we'll try and resolve what we're going to do. And I didn't leave it. Then I was talked into running for public office by a couple of the local National Party MPs. It was not something I'd gone looking for or expected. I'd always had a bit of a love of a verbal stoush and an argument. I'd always been interested in ideas, I suppose, but never seen myself in that role. If you'd said to me when I was in my mid-20s, one day you'll end up in the federal parliament, I would have said you've got to be joking. And if you'd said you'll end up as Deputy Prime Minister, I would have said you're stark raving mad. But life is not something you plan out in the way that I think perhaps some young people think you ought to be able to do. It's not like that. You've got to try and prepare yourself for the one certainty in life, apart from death and taxes, which is that life will take unexpected turns.
So how did they convince you?
Well, that's a good question, really. Maybe they played to my vanity. I made a short speech at a public meeting once where I actually politely but quite firmly, and I think with, funnily enough, a bit of humour, people laughed. took on something that I thought the local federal member had said that was a bit shy of the mark. And then he, instead of holding it against me, very shortly after that, asked me to go and have a yarn to him. And he said, look, I'm getting to retirement age. I want you to run and replace. And my jaw hit the floor. It had never occurred to me. I didn't know what was involved. You know, I was a member of the party and secretary of one of the branches. And it never occurred to me that I might run one day for office. Genuinely never occurred to me. And then out of the blue, bang, here's this proposition. I was only 27. And my father was, what on earth are you talking about? You must have rocks in your head. Forget that idea. But I wasn't totally convinced, and I asked, quite intentionally, that I'm going to ask 3 wise men that I really trust, all older men. And all of them said, throw your hat in the ring, have a go, we'll get right behind you. And I suddenly thought, well, this sometimes happens in life. They must have seen something in me that I'm not aware of. And so I had a week to think about it, and I thought, oh, well, hang it, why not? I'll have a go. So I did. I ran for pre-selection. And I was the youngest in a field of 5. I realised that the age was counting against me, so I thought I had to tackle this, try and turn it into my greatest advantage. And it worked, and I was pre-selected. And then the seat was abolished before there was an election. There was a redrawing of the boundaries. So I went back to the farm and actually got married to Julia, and we started our family, and I thought, well, that's that, with some relief. Only to discover that I was approached again by the then member, because I'd been redistributed into another seat. And he came to me and said, I'm going to retire, are you ready to run? And I said, no, I've moved on. And he said, you can't do that. You've got to have a go. You know, you've got something to offer, and it's needed. And that was very kind of him. And I found that really hard, because I had moved on mentally. I thought, no, that's not for me. But I did throw my hat in the ring. It was a much bigger and very fiercely fought contest. I was seen as the one to get, because I dared at the age of 27 to put my hat in the ring, and I'd won. So it turned into a sort of 9 against 1 pre-selection, and I learned how ugly politics can be when you're fighting your own. Didn't enjoy it much. Anyway, I won the pre-selection and ended up as the member. 31, I think I was the second youngest in the House of Reps at the time. And things unfolded from there.
And so at what point had you joined the National Party?
When I went home from university, everybody belonged in those days. Looking back on it, it wasn't so terribly long after the Whitlam years. And the Whitlam years had created a deep fear of bad government policy in rural Australia. And people had joined the National Party in unbelievable numbers. It had the biggest membership, rank and file membership, of any political party in Australia at one stage. And so when I went back, I thought, well, it's one of the things you do. Everyone belongs to the National Party. So I joined up.
And what were the main things you cared about back then?
I was very concerned about agriculture and giving it every possible advantage. Because I'd been trying to expand our own family agricultural business at the time. I think even then I was inclined to think that, you know, in the area of social policies, things like education were very important, and what was schooled, you know, what was taught. It's not just get our kids a good education, you know, get more teachers, whatever. It's what people were taught. And I still think that's a big problem. I think the Australian curriculum has been manipulated for political ends, particularly in the humanities. I think the declining standards, absolute and relative, should have every parent and every government in Australia saying, we've got to do something about this. Our kids are not being properly equipped for the workplace. And I'm not really blaming teachers here at all. I can't. I've got 2 daughters and a son-in-law who teach, and I'm married to a teacher. But I think we've made it nearly as tough for them as we have for the kids, with a poorly designed curriculum, too much clutter, and not enough opportunity for, frankly, classroom atmospherics, if I can put it that way, to be set appropriately. I was very interested in economic reform. I always had a very strong view that the Australian government's primary purpose, if you go back to why it was set up in the first place, was to run, keep Australia safe, and the two major components of that are running a strong economy and a proper defence force. So that I always saw those as the central objectives, central reasons for being for a federal government. But I also believed that farming, to be honest, I always felt that the National Party had been a little inclined in looking for this little deal and that little package and that little arrangement for orderly marketing, not saying they weren't important for rural Australia, but overlooking the fact that what farmers primarily needed was a competitive economy with the lowest possible interest rates, the best possible exchange rate, industrial relations efficiencies, transport efficiencies, communications efficiencies. And those things were needed right across the board, not just for agriculture, but for business everywhere. And so, I think it's probably true to say that philosophically I was very closely aligned to John Howard. Sometimes people say, you were too closely aligned. The National Party lost some of its distinctive flavour, but how do you argue with somebody who essentially, it's not just that we got on well personally, but with whom you shared political sort of values and beliefs, and who, to be fair to him, whenever I was worried about something that was important to rural Australia, he'd say, well, give me a case. And 9 times out of 10, he'd say, well, all right, well, I'll support you, we'll go and do it. And I think, look, it was tough. Government's not easy. You look back and people say nice things, and they often do. Wish you were back. You sort of think, well, that's nice. I'm not sure you wished that when I was there. But I nonetheless think that it was a reasonable period of good governance in Australia, and I think we still stand on the shoulders, to be fair, of the reforms of the Hawke and Keating era, and of the work that we did on the economy and industrial relations and tax.
What were some of the biggest learning experiences for you during that?
Oh, goodness, there were a lot of big learning experiences. Nothing compares to the shock of finding yourself as a cabinet minister when you've not been there before at that level, and you suddenly are hit with an avalanche of issues. You've got to juggle the government's priorities and the realities at a senior level of having been able to defend just about every policy the government's putting up or pursuing at the same time as you're across your own portfolio and in contact with your own people. And sometimes you just felt like it was a tsunami of things coming at you all the time. It's not as easy as people might think.
Did you develop your thinking on areas or change your mind on things that you didn't think you would?
Two-part question. You learn an incredible amount, so you develop a lot. You're just exposed to so much, and you have to be a quick learner. And you need to learn. I think this is something that I'd say not a lot of politicians now seem to be very good at. You need to learn to evaluate each policy proposal as it comes up, or as you put it up yourself, against your core objectives and your political philosophy. Does it advance the sort of Australia I want, or is this just some bolt-on to win me a few votes, or defer a problem, or to pass the problem on worse to our children and our grandchildren? Did I change my thinking? Probably in quite a few areas, really. I think I became more than ever convinced of what a good taxation system looks like. I think I probably became more convinced of the need to recognise that in a democracy the 4 essential freedoms, as I would call them, freedom of conscience and belief, speech, association and private property, are things that the government, ironically, doesn't own and gift to its people. They belong to the people, and you're entrusted only with enough control over people, I suppose you could say, or power over people, as to take forward the things that individuals can't do themselves. And ironically, you need to be the protector of the very things that don't belong to you that you might like. We saw this during COVID. Government, particularly in Victoria, took powers on itself and then gifted back some freedoms when it suited them in a limited way, as though those freedoms were in the gift of the government to give to people. It's the wrong way round. In a democracy, the citizens are entrusted with those freedoms, and they should grant only what they need to government so that society can work, and the government should defend those freedoms against itself taking them over, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And it's one of the things we've lost sight of, and it really worries me. It really worries me that maybe as an American conversationalist that I had on my series recently said, when there's no God over government, government becomes God. And we treat it too reverent. In one way, we're too cynical because it doesn't deliver. It's not God. It's not perfect. It's made up of human beings. But in another way, we actually are too submissive to government. And the old saying that Benjamin Franklin warned of in America, those who seek security above freedom end up being worthy of neither. And it's a pretty profound insight. During COVID, we did see too many people flee for security without stopping to think about the impacts of freedom and their right to live their lives and flourish as they chose. And you ask about change. I think I was a bit slow during that COVID period to understand fully the arguments that some people were making about these restrictions on freedom and the bad ways governments were behaving. That's a bit of a mea culpa from me. I was too slow to see that it was going a bit too far, too fast.
Yeah, I'm so worried about it as well, and I don't understand. I don't know if it's a values thing. I know you wrote something about this recently, how some people would rather just give their power over to some kind of these elites or experts or something who can just govern us. And I'm like literally having this conversation with one of my good friends at the moment that's making me so upset that I'm like, what are you? He's like, yeah, we should just have experts in charge of us. And it's like I don't understand.
No, I'm glad you raised that, because we do live in the age of what Frank Ferruti calls the expertocracy, where those experts think, these people can't be trusted to get it right. We know better than them. That's not how democracy works. Democracy was set up. It gradually evolved as we recognised the need to contain power and not to allow dictatorial or authoritarian regimes to squash our individual liberties and therefore our opportunity to flourish. And it's a cop-out to hand over responsibility to our lives to an expertocracy. Of course we need experts, but they should be respectful of the people. Now, there's another side to it, though. We as citizens have to be responsible. And when you think democracy, perhaps, as Os Guinness points out, especially in America, people often think of the famous quote from Abraham Lincoln, democracy is government of the people, by the people, for the people. That's a well-known old saying. What's not known is that Abraham Lincoln had heard a parson say it in a church service a few weeks before he gave that famous address. And the parson was quoting somebody from England, a John Wycliffe from Oxford University in the 14th century. What did he mean? What was the point? Government of the people, by the people, for the people. What Wycliffe was actually arguing for was responsible citizenship, where people accepted the need to conduct their own lives properly, to interact properly in their family context, in their community system, to be able to govern their own lives so that governments themselves would not be able to usurp their property, and wouldn't need to usurp their, or be too dictatorial. Because people who are responsible citizens, they don't want or need as much government interference, if I can put it that way. They don't need the expertocracy determining how they ought to behave. And having had practical experience of this, if you simply take something like the Tax Act, the way in which, Australia's Tax Act is one of the most complex in the world. It had filled this massive room that we were in with tomes of tax law if you wanted to, because people were always looking for a way to be less than responsible citizens. And it was a famous jurist in this country, in England, as I recall it from my law days, who made the comment that tax avoidance is every citizen's responsibility. Tax evasion is illegal and you shouldn't do it. It's about responsibility. It's about respecting your fellow citizens and living in a way that means, because you govern yourself properly, governments don't have a role in interfering any more than is necessary for the good ordering and smooth functioning of a society.
So what were some of your proudest achievements from your time in politics?
It's a good question, and I'm often asked it, and I always think, oh, gee, I'll sound cocky if I say something here about what I did. So I'll start by saying it was an enormous sense of achievement for me to have been part of a team that made a difference, that paid down the debt, left money in the bank, that made the country more efficient, and that produced real results. Unemployment came way down. We were really surprised at the time. We went beyond what the economists regarded as full employment. Real wages started to rise. Youth unemployment came crashing down. I think to have been part of those, the team that did those things, I still pinch myself and say, was I really so fortunate? There were many individual policies that I was proud of, although it was allowed to drift into the sand by successive ministers and governments. The National Water Initiative, which sought to vastly improve the water management and to strip away old models of entitlement to water through patronage and land title and what have you, and develop mechanisms to ensure that it was used wisely and went to the places of highest value. Water is very critical in a continent like Australia. I was very proud of that. National Transport Plan, and much of the stuff we did in rural and regional Australia, which has lasted to this day, were things that I was proud of, but they're not what I'd rather focus on. I'd rather say I was unbelievably fortunate to have been part of a government that I think put the country on a much better footing. And I think we still stand on a lot of that work today. We should probably let them in, and we might just duck around the corner. Yeah. Testing 1, 2, 3. The volume's still right.
It's like you have a whole 2-hour interview and they will just cut it to make... I mean, would you have experienced that when you were the media there? Oh.
I hated doing pre-records because they just edit whatever they liked.
And deliberately
suit their own slant, their own purposes. Very manipulative, the media. Very little professionalism in media.
Do you think it's got worse?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Because of this incredible lack of modesty on the part of so many people that come out of our media schools now, where they're fed a left-wing mantra, and truth is what the left says it is, and objectivity goes out the door.
And I guess because they have to compete now with platforms like yours, and they just have to become more... I mean, the whole thing's changed with social media and everything.
Yes, it has. And it'll keep changing, I think. We still don't know where it'll all land. I mean, one of the great problems that everyone talks about is the way on social media you follow the feeds that interest you. And I see that all the time. I'm interested in a certain genre of thinking. So now whenever I open up, a podcast series, I'm taken to a whole lot of people whose views are broadly similar to mine. And it's a really hard thing to then go and say, well, what are others saying? You're not getting a lot of diversity. The other thing that's really interesting, though, on this question of, we were talking about expertocracy a little while ago, or experts telling us how to live. People are very discerning, as you've just noted. And one of the things I've learned as a video podcaster is that if I deviate from my model and start to interrupt or put up alternative views, or even ask what might be seen as harsh questions that might have an element of entrapment or gotcha moments about them, my subscribers hate it. And they'll say, that is not your normal model, don't do it. We listen to your channel because you let us listen and interpret and draw our conclusions. It's not for you to do it. And so I did a humble pie and say, well, that's actually right. I'm trying to provide a conduit where people can say what they want to say and the listeners can tap in and say, well, that's what that person really thinks, and I'm not getting it through the lens of the host. Now, having said that, of course, I'm trying to kick the conversation along in ways that I think are relevant and important and helpful. And I don't always get that right. Of course I don't, but I do try.
Yeah, I was just going to say on that budget deficit point, I think that is something that in today's environment, the idea of the government paying back debt and, with everything that's going on in the US with the debt ceiling, and it's like beyond the comprehension of, the average person. But I know you have a whole conversation with Jordan Peterson when he's asking you guys, like, wow, this is amazing. How did you achieve this?
I think the central element there, it's beyond comprehension because we don't talk about it enough. And I think that's a terrible blight on the modern debate. You see whole election campaigns go by now without people discussing the big issues that will determine whether we're free and prosperous in the future. It's incredible to me. We debate things that are here today and gone tomorrow, and they might be important in themselves, but they don't have much bearing on our children and grandchildren's future prospects, for example. And so people sometimes say to me, don't do too much economics, our eyes glaze over. To which my response is, well, that means we're not doing a good enough job of explaining why good economics is actually good social policy, because it determines the services we can provide, the taxes you have to pay, the job opportunities that the next generation will have. If we get it out of kilter too much, there's a whole lot of your taxes that just go to paying interest, like having a mortgage that's too big, and you have to cut back on the things you want to do because you're not managing your mortgage. We're not using the right language to say why good economic management is a profoundly important matter when it comes to, for want of a better word, human flourishing.
Yeah, and I think you explain it in your recent conversation with Peter Costello. You're talking about how it's actually taking away from future generations by borrowing. Because I think people just don't understand it, which is not. It's because we're not really taught, or we don't learn about it. We don't talk about it. So it's like governments, they don't have money. They have taxpayers'
That's
money.
right.
So we pay taxes. That's how the government gets money. It's also companies don't have money. They have the shareholders' money. It's people.
And people don't understand that.
Yeah.
And there's a reason. Let me be really frank about this. Most of our children are exposed to a relentless diet at school, but particularly at university, from teachers and academics who either don't understand basic economics or are against what they see as filthy capitalism and the profit motive. Well, let me start with the latter one first, the profit motive. Done properly, any transaction will mean that both sides feel that they have profited. If I am a spinner and a weaver in a simple rural community in a less sophisticated society than the one we now live in, and I work out how to produce 2 shirts instead of just one in a given time slot, I can sell that shirt at a profit to somebody else who needs and wants a shirt and is prepared to pay that price. If there's no coercion, we've both profited. And then I can reinvest that profit in producing perhaps 5 shirts next time. And that has been where the ending of our short, brutish lives has essentially come from. What do I mean by short, brutish lives? Most human beings down through the ages have had short lifespans. They've been brutal, they've been very uncomfortable, very unpleasant. That's the reality of life. The profit motive, the advancement of technology, the advancement of freedoms like property rights have been the things that have given us these opportunities. We have become fat, lazy and indulgent in many ways and assumed that they will go on like some magic pudding if you destroy the fundamental underlying constructs that allow them to happen. And I think this is very problematic. It's a bit like eyesight. We'll sure complain when we can't see anymore. And while our eyes still work well, while they're still functioning, we take them for granted. Well, we shouldn't.
So what do you think we can do about it?
Well, you're doing it. We need to have a better conversation. That's precisely why it's a delight for me to talk to a young fellow Australian who is asking these questions and presumably reaching, who knows out there, who might say, now there's a highly intelligent and thoughtful person asking an old bloke who's been around a bit some questions, and the answers are really important, and I want to engage in that debate. And the old Margaret Mead idea, it only takes a few people to change the world. Indeed, that's the only way change has ever really happened down through the ages. We need to raise up a genre of people who think much more clearly and deeply than the zeitgeist, if you like, the spirit of the age allows for. And I know through my own podcasts, nothing brings me more delight than running into young people who say, I've really learned something. You've got me thinking. I've got a different set of perspectives. And let me say this to people who set school curriculums. I'm not wanting to have a shot at teachers. I want to emphasise that again. It's the people who set the curriculums in the big departments where they're very politically correct and where they're into full-scale social engineering, some of them. There's no other way of putting it. Don't think your students don't see through you. The number of young people who say to me, we know we're being fed bulldust. We know that. You need to do better, fellas. You really need to lift your game and teach people, young people, how to think clearly again. Stop trying to instill them with values. Most of what you call values aren't values. They're ideas that might have a short-term faddish popularity. You shouldn't be telling children how to think, what to think, sorry. You should be teaching them how to think. Critical thinking is desperately needed.
And I guess how to have a conversation, how to politely, respectfully listen to ideas. And that's kind of, I always invite, because people get worried about saying things now, but it's like always an invitation. No one on this platform is trying to offend anyone, first of all, but if, someone's confronted with something they don't agree with, or if we've got something wrong, there's an invitation to come and, educate me, and so we can develop our thinking and move forwards and do that whilst respecting each other and knowing, we're all just humans, we're all just trying to navigate our way through this life, which, as we started talking about earlier, is really hard. I think that's what we all share as humans. Life can be tragic and really difficult. And
I agree. And one of the things I have against this sort of victimhood culture is that somebody who's got a gripe in life goes and finds somebody else they can set up as a victim. So it'll be based on all sorts of narrowly selected criteria. And you can almost always guarantee that there'll be certain types of people who it's just assumed they can't be a victim. If you're a white male from a nice suburb in Sydney, the current spirit of the age would say you could never be a victim. How do you know? You don't know what sort of traumas those people have been through. You don't know what their life experiences have been. And the same thing with some of the people who are declared to be victims. I'm not saying there aren't victims. There are people, absolutely, that deserve our care and our compassion, and I would say our engagement to try and lift them out of their victimhood, not weaponise it and then keep them as victims. But the reality is that a lot of the people who are painted as victims really have very little to complain about.
And so what do you think we can do for the people in society who are left behind?
Well, I think we do a lot of it already, but you need to construct things like welfare policies very carefully. The objective should always be to help people to be as self-reliant and as independent and, if you like, as personally fulfilled as possible. And you can never do that with a simple government check. You know, you need a strong and thick web of community relationships. And the most basic community, of course, is family. And a great deal of the dislocation and unhappiness we have at the moment is because the term family's become nearly meaningless. It's many kids, it means nothing. There's just a highly transient set of adults in their lives. To be fair, most mothers are constants, but in every other way, family life is not a place where they feel a great refuge and acceptance and love, unconditional love, the sort of love that helps you through even when you've made a mistake. Pretty basic and old-fashioned wisdom. But it's decried so much now. And you see this increasing emphasis on saying, oh, well, can't trust parents to do the right thing. The state had better take over the education and the instilling of values in our children. That's a disastrous idea. Absolutely disastrous. Reinforce the parents. Reinforce the home and family environment. This applies to Indigenous communities in Australia as much as anyone else. So that you're building young people's lives into a pattern of being able to cope, being able to survive, lift themselves up off the floor when things go wrong, understand the importance of commitment in relationships, and frankly, be realistic about the fact that life's not always going to be easy, and you need to build more than resilience. Resilience just means you bounce back into shape if something goes wrong. Jonathan Haidt talks about anti-fragility, the old idea that tough times should build in more character. When something goes wrong, you come back stronger, not just to what you were before. And we've decried that notion, and I think that's a big mistake. Many of the people I most admire in life have had to come to grips with real difficulties. It's had very little to do with whether they're wealthy or the colour of their skins or whatever. It's that life is tough, and what you do when times go wrong, and whether you grow through the experience and then go on to help others through their tough times, or whether you collapse into a wallowing. I don't want to sound unfair on those who are really facing tough circumstances, not for a moment. But I am saying that there's a big difference between doing what you can to cope with the circumstances and saying to somebody else, oh, I can't cope at all, I can do nothing for myself. It's someone else's fault and somebody else has got to fix up the problem. For most people, that's not a winning formula.
And I know you've had a lot of conversations about, I think that was the first conversation of yours I listened to about the whole idea of fatherlessness and the outcomes for children. So yeah, there's lots that people can listen to, but that I guess, because I know you have a busy day of recording, to finish up, I'd love to ask you about what prompted you to create Conversations with John Anderson.
I think on the question firstly of fathering, I think we have a fatherlessness crisis in Western society. And it's affecting boys and girls. And neither sex does well when the other one isn't doing as well as it should do. So we've got a boy crisis. You've only got to look at the self-harm statistics and the jail populations, particularly in America, it has to be said, to see that there's a boy crisis. I think since I left school, the American population's doubled, but the prison population's gone up. by 750%. Staggering figure. So we need to recognise that the absence of fathers in the lives of a lot of young people, particularly young men, is having a very deleterious effect. Father figures matter. So dads, be encouraged. And if someone's in a situation where there's no dad around, well, stop and think, can I play a useful role in engaging in that young person's life in a constructive way? Be a father figure. Often grandfathers and uncles can do that. Sometimes, we know, horrendously, they'll do it very badly. But overwhelmingly well-intentioned people can make a huge difference where there's a father figure that's needed, in my view, done properly. Why did I start the podcast? Because when I left office in 2000 or left the Parliament in 2007, just prior to the great financial crisis, Australia was in a purple patch. The economy was going well, employment was strong, living standards were rising, opportunities for young people. It's hard to believe now. But then the great financial crisis hit. And what I was struck by afterwards was a horrendous explosion in debt on the part of governments. And the fact that no one, politicians or electors, were prepared to say, well, we better clean this mess up a bit for the sake of our children. That's what drove it. And I thought, we're getting lazy and indulgent and not understanding clear thinking. We're wishing hard problems away. So a friend and I thought, well, one of the things we could do maybe is to provide a conduit for really first-class thinking. It was a few years after the GFC. We've been going about 5 years now. And we found a really surprising appetite for them. And I enjoy it because I meet a lot of interesting people through it. And we get a lot of interesting feedback, and it starts some fantastic conversations. Having said that, to be honest, it's also quite hard work.
Yeah. I mean, I'm very impressed at you straight off the plane after 24 hours or whatever, straight into recording.
Well, I enjoy it. I'm very keen on human interaction. I find it very energising. It's very kind of you to seek out my thoughts, because my essential task is to try and get others to expand on their thoughts. So I hope I haven't put your listeners to sleep.
No, not at all. Okay, last 3 quick questions to finish up, unless there's anything else you want to add. Is there a book that's had a big impact on your life?
Well, there is. There have been several, to be honest. But I would say that the book that has made this world, in many ways, is the one that's now so often decried. It is the Bible. It does actually set out, for example, people don't realise this, but the idea of covenantal governments, responsible government. It doesn't set out a model for democracy, but it provides the values it provided, the worth and dignity of every individual, being respectful enough to hear their views, give them a say, be wise enough to know that they're corruptible, and you need a mechanism for changing governments to the point of a pencil rather than a gun. So that would be one observation. But there are many other books that I've read. One of them, I'll mention, a really obscure one, but for Australians, the one recorded history we have that I'm aware of a non-Dreamtime Aboriginal community and its leader, is a book, is a story, the story of a man called the Red Chief. Came from my own area. The Red Chief was a very big man. We know that because shamefully his skeleton was dug up. He was about 6'3", big square-shouldered man. He saved a tribe which had become fat and lazy and ill-disciplined and indulgent from extinction. A nation, so to speak. It's a fascinating story. So The Red Chief, there's a book that I recommend for Australians who are thinking through all the issues around the voice at the moment. And the message is, yes, it's a story of a hero, but it's also a powerful reminder that there were wars then. It wasn't a utopia. There were dangerous times. Bad things happened. And we need to be realistic, not weepy-eyed and think that some cultures are perfect and others are not. It's not like that. Wherever human nature goes, there'll be a mixture of good and bad.
How do you stay grounded?
Probably my wife. She's a very, very grounded person. And she's very quick to pull me into line if I need grounding. And I would say a good circle of friends who are honest. And good friends will sometimes tell you painful things.
And last question, what 3 words describe the best version of you?
The best version of me? I don't know. I'm very wary of answering that. I think the only thing I would say is it 3 words? I try to contribute.
Nice. Thanks so much.
I hope that's some value. It's been great fun talking to you.